You're listening to Nurture Your Zest. I'm your host, Ashleigh King, and I will introduce you to a wealth of interesting, fascinating individuals from all walks of life who will share their stories, how they've overcome challenges, and you will find out their top tips for success. Through this podcast, you can gain tips to grow and change your life and the way you see the world, and help you to nurture your zest. Hello everyone. Today I'm joined in the studio by my good friend Kemi.
Hello.
Hi Kemi. Thank you so much for coming in today.
No problem at all.
Can you tell me a little bit about what it is for you first of all, what do you do?
Okay, I'm a third year student at Newcastle University. I study media communications and cultural studies, but outside of my studies, I'm really passionate about kind of equality and diversity and race relations in the UK.
It's a very interesting subject, and I know that in the past we've worked together on some cool projects, Harumbe Pasadena Afro Fusion Festival, for example, and I know as well you were president of the Afro Caribbean Society at Newcastle University, which is an awesome society, by the way. I did go to the meetup as a student recently, and I just couldn't believe how alive and vibrant and just amazing it was. There's a huge atmosphere around that society, and I so enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a really cool society. It's like a mini family, which you don't obviously get sometimes with society. So it's really, really good.
I think what really inspired me was how much work goes into that society, but also the freedom of being able to debate. I think debate's really healthy, but it comes when people feel safe to share ideas and to share that maybe they don't always agree on those ideas, because debating can be kind of scary. So I love that with the Afro Caribbean Society there's such an incredible program happening this year. Got to take my hat off to Sarah for all of her work. So Sarah is the current welfare officer, sabbatical officer at Newcastle University, and she's done an incredible Black is Gold campaign for Black History Month. Can you tell us a bit about that, Kemi?
Yeah, so just a preface, kind of Sarah being welfare equality officer has been kind of monumental, at least for me and the Black community, because she's the first woman of colour, first Black woman to be a welfare officer for the SU. And so it's been really exciting to have that kind of representation in place. But essentially the Black is Gold campaign is a Black History Month campaign focused on highlighting Black excellence and giving a voice for Black students and other people across campus to highlight who they are and who they represent and who they want to be. And so the campaign is really just so nice to see. It's been so fun to be part of. And there's obviously things going on throughout the month, but it's been such a fun campaign to do across campus.
Absolutely. It's been really cool. For me, the highlight was the fashion show and just the collaboration with other societies. So collaborating with Newcastle University Fashion Society just the electricity again of everyone in the room, the atmosphere. It's really special. What you said before about Sarah being the first woman of colour to be a welfare officer, is she also the first woman of colour to be a sabbatical officer altogether for the student union?
Mm-hmm. So there's been one full-time sabbatical officer prior, but she's the second person. I think she's definitely the first to be a woman of colour as a full-time sabbatical officer. So it's quite monumental.
That is monumental, and I'm really excited about that too. In many ways, I think Newcastle University is very forward-thinking and quite progressive when it comes to equality, diversity and inclusion. But I think that it's amazing that that's happened, and I do think it's, like you say, something that Black community would want to celebrate. It's really exciting. I wanted to ask you, so how did you first become aware of race relations and how important they were? Has something happened, or have you had an experience that made you realize that this was an area that you really wanted to become passionate about?
Yeah, it's been a bit difficult. I think it was mainly actually during sixth form. I got interested. I've always been quite interested in politics in general, but I got into debating. And around that time, I had this humongous debate that I had to do, and it was to do with Britain paying Africa reparations. And I remember spending ages researching for the debate. And on top of that, around that time, I was in a very white sixth form. I was like one out of two of the only minorities. And so kind of the debate and then being in that environment kind of sparked my interest in kind of race and representation, all that kind of stuff.
So as maybe one or two people of colour in a institution, in a school, in a college, how does that feel different? How did you experience that?
I think for me, it was mainly the social exclusion, to know that you're different, and to not be accepted, for your difference not to be accepted, kind of was the main takeaway I took from that environment. And also the racism, and also the racism not being taken seriously or listened to. Those are kind of the two aspects that kind of, the two aspects of the experience, really, yeah.
Something that's really struck me recently is actually it's part of what Sarah's been doing with the Black is Gold campaign, but words hurt. And actually microaggressions have such an incredible impact on people, but we don't realise it. So a few years ago, I was involved in a role at Newcastle University that was very focused on equality, diversity and inclusion. And as part of that, I did some training with the Race Equality Charter, which is an exciting initiative that they're bringing forward. And I really enjoyed that training. But one of the things we focused on was microaggressions. So I'm embarrassed to say, but one of the things I always used to ask people is, where are you from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would always mean that in the way of, I'm from South Africa. I miss home so much. I really want to connect with other people who might understand the culture I've experienced. Tell me about where you're from. Let's connect. And also this sense of always feeling that missing home and wanting to, connect and meet with people from all over the world. What I realized, though, was when I asked that question, it makes people feel like they don't belong, or they're not in a place where, or it makes it obvious that they don't belong there, or they stick out. And so that was quite an interesting lesson to learn. And I wonder, have there been situations like that where you've maybe had friends or people treat you a certain way where maybe they didn't mean to, but they realized actually through a discussion or a conversation that maybe some of the things they were doing were microaggressions?
Yeah. Because it kind of happens on a very, I don't know what the word is, but almost a sly basis. People don't always notice that what they're saying kind of puts you in an uncomfortable environment. Like I remember having a conversation with two white females, and they were speaking about their hair being frizzy. And they used a term that their hair was nappy. And obviously the term nappy has loads of connotations to it. And so it's those kind of insensitive comments that can kind of make you feel like, okay, is that a reference to my hair or frizzy hair not being nice or beautiful, that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting the words we choose to use, actually. I've heard that as well. I have very frizzy, curly hair naturally, and I actually, my favourite curl conditioners and things like that are all from Afro Caribbean shops. They're amazing, some of the products that you can get. But it's interesting, the concept of, appropriating culture, and actually by doing that, are you taking up somebody else's space? Should you be there? And should I be there as a white woman sometimes? Mm-hmm. I do think it's a really interesting conversation. And it's interesting what you were saying about language. And actually language was a key thing as part of those pictures is, one of the things that really surprised me was some women have been told, you're pretty for a black girl. That one hit me hard, because I just thought, wow, like that's just such a strange thing to say. What does that even mean? How do you deconstruct that or dissect it? Where does it start? And I think these conversations can get really controversial. They can get very heated.
Yeah, for sure.
So I guess relating to that is how can people understand who maybe aren't aware right now? How can they become more aware of what they're doing? Do you have any tips on what people could do to kind of start changing the way society is?
Yeah. And I think it's really important that people decide to make that move. I think it's important that people decide to become allies, because I think unity is really where power is, and collaboration is really where power is, collaboration across ethnicities. So for me, it's really about educating yourself. We have the internet. The internet is a lovely bubble. And so I always tell people to go on the internet, look at the key questions. There's amazing books by Black authors that will break down race and what white privilege is and institutional racism and all those kind of key terms. As well as, I think, on both sides of the spectrum, having open conversations to create spaces where people feel safe across all races to kind of sit down and understand what racism is and understand how we can overcome it. I think those safe spaces are really important to ensure that conversations don't just become heated and then we don't actually reach a conducive conclusion. But yeah, definitely education, and then those kind of conversations that are inclusive and open and not intimidating for people is really important.
Absolutely. One thing that frustrates me a lot is the lack of diversity in leadership and in and I do mean from a cultural perspective, having representation from many different cultures, but also from other groups that are marginalised. So I'm also talking about perhaps people who are disabled, or maybe you might have a committee in any workplace where they are maybe making decisions about the workplace and accessibility, but without considering somebody who is not able to walk or things like this. And I find that just, how can anybody be so close-minded or not realize that, but there does seem to be a bit of a blinker effect. And so definitely the diversity of people around the table, it's only with different groups and different perspectives that you can have innovation and growth. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. Have you noticed that looking around you, looking at role models? Do you ever think about that, about the people in leadership positions around you?
Yeah, I think it's kind of become more evident within university that, like, all the different roles that I've had the privilege of being in, I've kind of just been the one Black person on the table. Like, even if it's like student staff committees, I'm always the one Black person on the table. If it's a panel, I'm usually like the one Black person on the table. And I think it's sad to see, because I almost feel like I am carrying the Black voice or the marginalised voice for everyone, and my perceptions and my thoughts can't represent everyone. And so having tables where everyone is represented is so important, because I honestly have this ethos that where there's more representation, diversity, that's where really creative ideas come out. It's where inclusive ideas come out. It's where ideas that go beyond the norm of what a white middle class man would say. And that's where like key innovation really happens. So, I mean, it's happening gradually, especially in Newcastle University. It's happening gradually. We are seeing more representation, but in a broader sense, there's just not a lot of diversity on these executive boards, and there needs to be, really.
Absolutely. And I agree, across all industries and all backgrounds and places, we really do. I hope that this changes. I noticed I've been doing a lot of research into Japan at the moment. I'm doing an assignment on Japan and France's economics and global transitions in economy. And it's been a bit tough. It's not my greatest area of expertise, but it's so interesting, the work that they've been doing to get their gender gap sorted, and actually they are so behind Europe in many ways, and although that is not a racial gap, this is a different gap. It's still very interesting to see how countries or organizations do things in practice. One thing that's kind of bothered me is I guess coming from South Africa, I am privileged, I know that, and for those who don't understand privilege, it might be useful to hear it, you explain it. But what I understand of it is that it's almost like an invisible knapsack. It's like something you carry around that maybe other people don't see, maybe nobody sees it. But it could be your skills or your connections or various things. And you actually mentioned that you've experienced privilege, or you describe yourself as, I am privileged to be in these positions. So it would be useful to hear what you feel privilege is, but also how you have privilege.
Yeah. Okay, that's a big question. But
Yeah.
I think privilege can be defined in a variety of ways. Essentially, if we bring it back to kind of race, if we bring back to white privilege, I see white privilege as kind of an opposition to meritocracy. It's kind of the idea that as a white person, in comparison to a black person, even though you may have the same merit, the same education, as a white person, you have a privilege based on your colour, that there will be some advancement in your life based on your skin colour, in comparison to a black person, whether that's education, money, finance, whatever it may be. But apart from that area, we are privileged in a variety of ways. So I'm privileged in that I have an education. Some people don't have an education. I also have some privileges because I'm able-bodied. And so there's levels to our privilege in regards to kind of when we compare it to marginalisation. Yeah, that's kind of the way I see privilege.
Yeah, I think that's a really a great explanation, actually. Thank you for sharing that. It's really interesting talking to you, Kemi, because I know that you were born in the UK, but your family are from Nigeria originally. So do you go home to Nigeria? Do you consider that home, or do you have family out there? How do you find that?
Yeah, I feel like being Black British is always like a difficult thing to navigate because everyone kind of navigates it so differently. But at least for me, growing up, I've been in a very Nigerian focused household. So even though I was born here, going just back to my house has always been, that's like home, that's like Nigeria. But every year I always go back to Nigeria, and I see family, which is amazing. But really kind of in regards to identity, for the longest time, when people did ask me the question, where are you from? I always said Nigeria, because I always saw it as to say I was Black or Nigerian, to say I was British always seemed out of place. It didn't seem like the two-word term that could be compatible. So I never really thought to link those two together. So I always just said I was Nigerian. But it wasn't until recently that I kind of looked within myself, and kind of looked into what Black British history is, and found an identity within being Black and British, and saw the two identities as compatible. So when people do ask me, I do say I'm Black British now. Yeah.
It's so interesting because there have been a lot of campaigns recently. I don't know if you saw the one recently about Black Scottish, and it was just basically all of these amazing people in Scotland who were talking about, I think, some of their experiences in their own words, where I didn't know there was anybody else like me, that type of phrase. And it was so interesting because I think there is something called colorblindness. So I really enjoy reading about race relations. I love books on the subject and the subject matter. One of my favorites is called I Am No Longer Talking to White People.
I love that book.
And in the middle it says about race.
Yeah.
And it's an extremely powerful book.
Such a good book.
But it's very triggering, and some people really don't like it.
Yeah.
And I guess the thing that strikes me about all of this is, some people genuinely don't have any sense of colour. And so you have these conversations and they're like, what are you going on about? Why are you making a big deal out of something? What you often see with women or men who are black is that, you know, they're being aggressive. Why are they being like this? And I hate that. I hate that stereotype. I wonder why that happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with the whole colourblind issue, it's very difficult because obviously everyone has their different perceptions on race and all that kind of stuff. But for me, I think in the age that we are now, with kind of race becoming more and more evident and the issues of race, I think it's really important that we confront race. I think when we sit down and look at the facts of what Britain is and what really made Britain great, it's really important that we unpack colonization, imperialism, and kind of the structures that are within society. I think actually talking about race, I said it before, but talking about race and having these conversations is really where we start to move towards what we could call a colourblind society. But as of right now, we're not there.
Absolutely.
But I think those conversations are really important. And I think also, I mean, I've been told that when I speak, I'm quite aggressive. But I think really where this so-called aggression comes from is really our passion. Every day, Black people and marginalised people are facing microaggressions, facing racism, facing institutional racism. And so there is this passion and want for our voice to be heard. I mean, our voice hasn't been heard for so many centuries that now we have this space to use a voice, the small voice we have. We want our voice to be heard. We're quite passionate. And I think sometimes that aggression is translated. I mean, that passion is translated into aggression, but really it's passion to want to be heard. It's passion that, you know, we should be listened to. This is something that's really important for our society to deconstruct and to be open about, really. Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing that. I think as well, you mentioned looking back at history, and that is such an important point because another one of my favourite writers, David Olusoga.
Yes, love him.
I love him too. He's fascinating,
yeah.
But also he is such a brilliant historian because he really researches his stuff, so he knows what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. Hearing his life story, how he was, bricks thrown at his house, or all kinds of things, and his feelings growing up were really interesting to read, but also looking at the research he's done.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It is. I found it incredible actually learning about the slave trade in Britain. I didn't know about that. And actually when you think about it, we did colonize a lot of the world, Britain, but also the slave trades went through our ports.
Yeah.
The ports of Liverpool and Manchester and all of these cities that, it's there in history. You can see evidence and proof of this. And I think, when you read a lot of the books we've been talking about, you do hear about words like, in terms like whitewashing. And there has been an element of our history being, shown in the way that's very, very kind, and I think actually the real reality of things can be quite scary. So if you look at Jane Austen, for example, one of my favorite writers, but in her original novels she spoke about slaves and things like that, but now these types of things are being extracted from the books because they're offensive. And it's interesting how times have changed and how our appetites for things have changed. But I think whitewashing things isn't helpful because acknowledging how things were, it is really intriguing though, because if you look at Egypt and all over Africa, the powerful leaders that there were, things like the Tudors, I didn't realize that there were Black Romans and Black Tudors in the UK, but it's just not represented in history. And there's some incredible historians out there doing this research. But these stories are often not heard.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And so over the summer, I basically did a research project about Black history in Newcastle. And it's crazy the connection that Newcastle has to Africa and beyond. I mean, if we look at Hadrian Wall, there was Black Romans, Frederick Douglass came here, Muhammad Ali came here. We have Yemens, we have a Yemeni community here. And yeah, so this city is highly diverse. And I think it's so important that we look at this history, because it's important that we look at what truly is Great Britain, what truly is the United Kingdom. I mean, our history has always been multicultural and diverse. There's always been different nationalities and ethnicities roaming the streets of England. And I think once we change our perception of what the UK has always been, we can really kind of transform our idea on what race is, and the importance of race and how important diversity has been in building this nation. But yeah, I don't like to call it a hidden history, because it's always been there, but it's a history that is slowly being unpacked, is slowly being picked up. And like you said, there's people around the UK who are kind of doing research into it. But I can't wait for the time that this hidden history just becomes mainstream history, that it's just normal that we understand where we've come from and who has helped us build this nation.
Absolutely. I do think as well, it comes back to that colourblind thing as well. What you said about needing to, people actually starting the conversation and talking about these things. If you don't acknowledge it and you just think all history is the same and the stories that we all hear are the same, that's not going to be helpful. I love learning these stories, and I love learning these histories. One thing that really shocked me when I was reading the book, I think it was the I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race book, was that there was a research experiment. If you ask a white woman and a black woman to describe themselves, the white woman would say, "I am a woman." The black woman would say, "I am a black woman." Have you done any research into that, or do you know why that might be? Why would that happen?
Yeah. I had this question actually last week because I was with Feminist Society. Really, at least for me, from a personal perspective, when people see me, at least in my view, when people see me, they see my skin first before I'm a woman. Because, I mean, even with the way we say black woman, we don't say woman black, we say black woman. It sounds, my skin is always kind of the first topic of conversation, and then people notice I'm a woman. That's at least how I see it. And as a black woman, it's very difficult to just see myself as one or the other. I always see myself as black and a woman. I can't really dissect or pull apart both those terms and look at them in isolation. Because at times, if I am getting catcalled or if I am sexually harassed, there's always a racial undertone to it. And so my experiences as a woman is never just as a woman. It's always as a black woman. So yeah, there's always that kind of intersectional side of understanding who you are as a black woman.
That's so interesting. And it's actually a really good point. The intersectionality is very important in race relations and also in opening up these conversations. And there are some incredible writers out there. I might recall the name wrong. Patricia Hill Collins, is that right?
Yes, that's
one of
right.
my favorite writers as well on, feminism and from a female woman of color perspective. It's really interesting.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. So I wanted to ask, becoming an activist or speaking out more, has that got you in trouble sometimes?
Yes. Yeah. Because one of my ethos is, if I don't say it, nobody will. And so I try and be kind of politically correct where I can, but really, when it comes to my activism and my passion, I just say it how it is. And at times that can come off as quote unquote aggressive. But really, I just put it out there. There's been a variety of events where I've said things and people have been like, that's way too much. But the most important thing is that when I do say these things, which are always out of creating a discussion and not out of hate, it has created a discussion. It's made people think about conversations. It's opened up new arenas for ideas. And so that's whenever I'm being explicit or open about something, that's always my aim, to make sure that a conversation, a debate is being had afterwards, really. Yeah.
Awesome. I love that. I mean, personally, I think it's great to stimulate these discussions. I do want to ask, do you think anybody can be an activist? I think a lot of people think of the word and they think, well, what does that mean? Could I do that? Am I that?
Yeah.
And actually through small, not rebellious, but I guess they are sometimes, just making the decision that you are going to contribute to a world that is different, that is going to be more inclusive. I think that can be a decision on to be an activist anyway. So I always try to do activism through niceness. And that could be maybe I don't have the confidence to go out and petition for this and that, but if I see there's no representation on a board, I might make sure that going forward that's changed, and use influence and my privilege where I can to create spaces to bring people with me. I think that's really something we can all do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think people have kind of a skewed perspective when it comes to activism. Activism doesn't necessarily have to be you going out on the streets with like a pitchfork being like, listen to me. Really, I see activism that can be done on all levels. Even you just choosing to open up your friendship group to more people, to have those conversations, that's a form of activism. I think the small little things that we do every day, like you said, kind of deciding to make this world a better place is a form of activism. And I think the more people that choose to make that small decision, the bigger difference we can make altogether. That's kind of where I see activism.
That's brilliant. I do have a question. It's quite controversial. So one thing that's always confused me, growing up in South Africa, as a white person, I was in the minority, but I was privileged and I enjoyed a wonderful life there. I get confused when people talk about Black and minority ethnic groups, because I know minority ethnic can take into account many different minorities, and it can actually also include, white travelers, gypsies, all these different types of ethnicities. But I find it really confusing and sometimes a little bit uncomfortable, a bit patronizing, just from my perspective, when I see colleagues or students coming from all over the world, particularly from Africa though, and then being labelled into this kind of word of BAME or Black and minority ethnic, because in their country they wouldn't have been in the minority. So it's almost like you are put in this little box. And sometimes it's like I wonder if it might be patronizing sometimes. And I wondered, have you ever come across that in your activism work or in the discussions you've had with other students? Have any students mentioned that before?
Yeah, I think the term BAME is kind of a two-edged sword. Personally, for me, I think BAME has become this kind of institutional word that's allowed kind of bodies within society to just kind of like group all the marginalised ethnic groups together and be like, okay, this is a one-stop policy we have and it's going to work for everybody. And I think that's kind of what it's become. But really, we know that each different ethnic group faces different issues. The needs I have as a British-born African is very different from a Nigerian who's coming here as a refugee or an immigrant. It's very, very different. And so there is problems with grouping us together and giving us kind of one policy. But on the other hand, it's an amazing term in regards to solidarity. So kind of the career conference that me and Ashleigh were part of, we were targeting mainly Black communities, but in a wider sense, BAME communities, because we can all work together. We're all facing very similar issues within the university. And so using that term to attract everyone was kind of a form of solidarity for us. And so, yeah, it's kind of like a two-edged sword. But realistically, I think when it comes to BAME, it's important to understand why you're using the term. And if you are kind of secluding people or kind of excluding people or not kind of dealing with their specific needs.
Absolutely. I loved that careers conference. I was really inspired by what you'd done, because I don't think anything like that had ever run before. So just for a bit of background, Kemi ran an amazing campaign when she was president of the Afro Caribbean Society, and actually to do a conference particularly for Afro Caribbean students and for BAME students, to look at the career opportunities they could go into. That was really interesting, and we had some fantastic speakers and some brilliant alumni came back. Some people who I find extremely inspiring myself, Ngozi Ozai, who has her own hair care business as an entrepreneur. I really look up to her. There were some brilliant people who came that day, but I still remember vividly, I was so angry. Do you remember?
Oh yeah, I remember.
So what happened was some profiles were sent of career opportunities, and these were to be given out to students at the event. And bearing in mind it was an event for Afro Caribbean students, and the career opportunities, all of the profiles were white.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe that. I was horrified. And I'm so sorry that happened.
No, it's fine.
It wasn't anything to do with me, but I just could not believe that. But that's an example of colourblindness, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I remember when I saw it on the table, I was like, oh no. Because, I mean, like, apart from the wider issue of representation within the university, it's kind of just demoralizing to think, okay, this is what I want to do. Like, for example, I want to go into biomed, like, let me look at what other people have done, and then just to see that nobody from, like, that doesn't look anything like you is just on that paper, and there's not even one person that has a sentiment of melanin in their skin on that paper. It's demoralizing. Yeah, really demoralizing. But yeah.
Bless you. So before we wrap up, I guess one of the things that I love the most about working at Newcastle University in the past, but also being a student there now, is the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King graduated there, 52 years ago. It's the anniversary, 13th of November this year. And that is just incredible to be at an institution where he came in 1967, first university to honour him with an honorary degree for his work in civil rights. And it was about 4 months before he was assassinated. What does that mean to you as a student? How do you feel about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To me, it's amazing because we have a really strong connection with civil rights, which is what exactly I'm passionate about. And I think it's given the university a sense of, at least in my eyes, it gives the university a sense of pride, but also a remembrance of representation, a legacy of representation, a legacy of equality and diversity, really. But kind of beyond MLK, I think it's becoming even more important that the university plays an important part in not just using his name, but going beyond that and kind of putting in the policies for equality and diversity, putting in the policies that will enable MLK's legacy to live on. Because it's beautiful having a statue, and it's beautiful having Luther's Bar, and it's beautiful having kind of the MLK suite, but it's even more amazing to see his legacy in action, to see Newcastle University kind of be a forward-thinking environment that welcomes diversity, that welcomes difference as something that can create really a global change.
Absolutely. I know you've been involved in a lot of work to kind of start looking at that change and driving that change. And certainly the work you've done in your role as president of Afro Caribbean Society and the community that you've helped support through that is constantly changing and, working towards these goals has been incredible. I know that they recently had 3 scholarships for refugees,
it's amazing,
which is pretty incredible as well. I must state as well that neither of us are representing Newcastle University today.
No, we're not.
We're just having a chat. But yeah, I personally feel it is a great institution.
Yes.
And seeing what they're planning and what they're doing, I find really inspiring, and I hope it sets an example for other universities.
Definitely, yes.
I wanted to ask you, Kemi, if you got to rule the world for a day, what would the world be like?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. If I could rule the day, what would it be like? If I could rule the world for a day, the world I see would be a world where compassion would overflow, where people would be compassionate and they would compare and they would love understanding and listening to other people's issues, where giving and understanding and listening would be the norm, really. That'd be good.
That sounds like an awesome world. So we're nearly done, but I have 2 more questions for you. So the first one is, we've spoken a lot about books today. So do you have a favorite book? It doesn't have to be about race, but it could be if you want it to be. But that's kind of changed your life, unlocked your thinking, nurtured your zest, cultivated your curiosity.
Oh, you kind of already mentioned my favorite book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Rennie Edo-Lodge, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. That book has like been a fundamental survival guide when it comes to racism for me. And it's a book that I have continuously over the past 2 years recommended to every person I've met. So that's one of my favorite books.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And my last question for you is, we always ask this, but if you could describe one word that matters to you, that gets you out of bed in the morning, that helps you to find yourself and connect with yourself or find your zest, what would your one word be?
Happiness.
Happiness.
Yeah. Everything I do it to be happy. My goal is to live a life where my happiness is placed first and where I can shine happiness on other people. So I wake up every morning thinking, this is going to be a really happy day.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. I feel so uplifted just thinking of that. That's really special, especially, with both students, been a long week already, lots of assignments due. We're both very active in societies. So happiness and radiating it everywhere.
Yes, positive energy.
Brilliant. Thank you. So thanks for your time, Kemi, and for helping us to think about how we can, especially, how the white community as allies can help create an open spaces or, start having some of these discussions and learning and actually having the courage to say, I messed up here, or I don't know how to say this. What would you prefer? Or can I just learn how to say your name properly? Or, start to have these conversations.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
It's been good.
You've been listening to Nurture Your Zest. You can find us online on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Nurture Your Zest. If you've liked today, please subscribe. You can also leave us a review if you're feeling extra kind. Today's podcast has been made available through the kind sponsorship of TL Multimedia and That Branding Company. We look forward to catching up with you again soon as you learn to nurture your zest.